a quick intro of our guest speaker, Tracy Kajumba. And then Tracy, I'll turn it over to you. And I've enabled screen sharing, so you should be able to share any slides that you have at the ready. Great. So I am just really excited to have this week of the course focused on climate justice and, the different ways that climate change is intersecting with all kinds of social justice movements around the globe. And we've really resonated with a lot of the feedback from fellows in the first 3 launches of our course that these kinds of sessions and talks are really important because we are a global cohort at Terra. We have fellows from 20 different countries, and hearing each country's experiences with climate change and how it intersects with other issues on the ground is just an incredibly important part of how we can build towards solutions. So yeah, we put together this week to have a series of talks and speakers on intersectional climate justice topics and lenses. So today we have Tracy Kajumba, who is a principal researcher in the climate change group at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And before IIED, Tracy was a regional senior climate change and development advisor for sub-Saharan Africa with Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She was also the country coordinator for the Africa Climate Change Resilience Alliance and advisor on gender, climate change, and conflict management with CARE International in Uganda. And she's also worked in the government of Uganda. Her current work involves leading the strategic direction and implementation of work addressing gender inequality, social exclusion, and climate change, supporting monitoring, evaluation, and learning for adaptation and fostering spaces for learning. She is also leading the Strengthening Partnerships team to facilitate and promote local to global knowledge exchange to catalyze effective action on climate change, ensuring that the voices of vulnerable and excluded groups are included in decision-making, and providing platforms for learning and sharing information, including grassroots voices. So Tracy, I'm just so glad you could join us today, and I'll turn it over to you to share more.
I think you've covered everything. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, that was a long one. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about climate justice and gender equality, things that we are talking about every day, and the struggle still goes on. I have a few slides that I wanted to talk through. You can see my screen, I guess. Yeah. So largely, I framed my discussion today around climate and gender justice. I was asked to focus on implementing women-led solutions in the context of adaptation, but also to recognize that whether they are women-led solutions, they don't stand in isolation. The context in which women or men operate determines how they adapt or not. So in this discussion, I've wanted us to focus on the global climate issues that really bring in the focus on where the injustices are and what the governance mechanisms look like, to look a bit on the inequality and the differentiated responsibility in relation with climate justice, gender equality, and a bit on the gender equality in the UNFCCC processes, and then the finance, which is very key for climate change, because what happens at the global level definitely affects what happens at the local level, definitely. And then I also tried to touch in a bit on the national issues, the burden of policies and requirements, how climate is managed, climate risk, and the differentiated impacts where we see the vulnerability coming in. And then how do we amplify the voices of youth and women for climate justice? First of all, before we talk about women-led solutions, we need to look at the global challenges in general and how this translates it for different people. First of all, the inability to share in a world of plenty is a big problem. That's why we talk about inequality. I remember the COP24 in Poland, a report was presented that said if food waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter next to China and the US. There's a lot of food being wasted, and there are countries where children are starving because they don't have food. And these are some of the sources of emissions. We talk about a global village. We talk about recognizing interconnectivity between issues, but then we fail to put in place adequate action to make sure that the interconnectivity of different things work for those that are least able to access some of the resources that we are talking about. We also have the issue of lack of recognition and responsibility for developed countries for the emissions that came from the industrial era and all. We know that the Paris Agreement, Article 3, talks about the common but differentiated responsibilities, but then it doesn't talk about the commitment. It's flexible, yes, and we failed to deliver on the 100 billion commitment. We failed to deliver on the emission targets. So that is a challenge. We also look at the developing world, which is looked at as the supply of cheap goods for economic development for those that are already developed, but the processes of production continue to damage the environment and increase emissions. And therefore, climate change comes in. The increasing inequality around gender, race, ethnicity, poverty, migration, urbanization. And when climate comes in, then it makes the situation worse. And environmental degradation at IID, we frame it as the assault on the natural world. The way we are destroying the world, you'll think that there's no hope for tomorrow. So all these problems compounded become a big challenge for those that are most poor or vulnerable or not able to influence. And then to make it worse, there's the climate crisis, where things don't look so good. When you look at the IPCC 1.5 degree report, it says we are running out of time. We are not doing well. The UNEP 2019 emission gap report noted that the NDC's ambition is not good enough. They need to be threefold to achieve the 2.0 degrees goal and more than 5 to achieve the 1.5. And I can be honest with you, we are not anywhere near. So the future doesn't look that good. And of course, the impacts are really worse for the poor and most vulnerable countries and individuals, the men, the women, the elderly, the youth. And when we look at the least developed countries, who we mostly work with, even here at IID, really our focus is on the least developed countries, they will suffer the worst impacts of climate change despite contributing less to the emissions. I just wanted to show you some of the pictures in the different countries that I go to during my work. And so I've interacted with most of these apart from the one from Bolivia. So in the first one, that is Sierra Leone, that gets flooding every year. Every single year flooding happens. There's lots of destruction, infrastructure, live food, everything. You can't even quantify the loss and damage that happens. And the next one is they got a landslide in 2017. In 4 minutes, over 1,400 people died. And below here, you see a girl putting down her books. That is Sierra Leone, the Idaho cyclone. Her school was washed away, her house was washed away, and she was putting her books outside to dry, hoping for tomorrow. I don't know if it came for her, it did not. But those are some of the impacts. The pastoralists who are affected by drought and they lose all their animals, and that's their source of livelihoods. There's a woman walking on a bridge with 3 logs, that's a bridge. And those women are walking to markets, supporting families and households. And when the floods come, those logs disappear, and that means they have no access. And in the corner, that was taken in Bolivia, where you see the risky conditions that people live in, the poor people live. It's very risky, really. If a flood comes or anything, the whole mountain could disappear. But still, people have become risk averse. Either they don't have choices or anything. But all these conditions really get worsened with the climate impacts that we are experiencing. So what is happening now at the global level amidst all these challenges? So climate governance at global level is really complex and very slow. The UNFCCC Paris Agreement is yet to deliver on the commitment of the 2 degrees. The adaptation policies are not fully implemented. There are gaps in horizontal integration because we're used, like I do agriculture, I do health, I do education, and yet climate impacts really cut across. From what we've seen, there's education affected, there's market systems affected. So it's really, it's across all sectors, but we are failing to bring things together. The SDGs are not on track. Based on the reports, if you look at the 2019 SDG report, the gaps there are very strong, and it's calling for support for country ownership of policy making. There's the call from the Sendai framework to invest in disaster risk reduction and shift from managing disasters to managing the risk of disaster. But most of the time, technocratic fixes have failed to work. We ignore local and customary knowledge in approaches of managing risk. So there's still a lot that needs to be improved there. And then also including social benefits in policy decisions is not working as much as the SDG emphasizes on that, especially for climate as well through sustainable consumption and production. But that integration is also not happening. So when we look at the inequality in those global discussions, there's the big debate on the historical emissions and the effects and how that links to the issue of climate justice. So there's the disconnect between the causes and effects. Yes, we've talked about the causes. It happened, we can't change that, but how do we respond? The response mechanisms, if you look at the UNFCCC mechanisms, it's really about common but differentiated responsibilities. There are no punitive measures. The commitment to the 100 billion was there, yes, but no country is really compelled to put in that. You can either put in or not put in if you want, and that's why we are failing to hit the targets. We are continuing to emit as much as we can. So that poses a problem. And then we have the inter and intranational, intergenerational distributive climate justice issues, where policy systems are not including views of women, of the youth, of most vulnerable communities. So that's why we are seeing big movements on the street to fight on climate, the school campaigns and everything. That is a result of the youth really feeling that they've been left out of that. But then again, we see climate intersecting with poverty, inequality, exclusion, and all this, making the problem even worse from the race perspective as well. And then we have the triple poverty, nature and climate interlocking crisis. And all this is rooted in humanity's destruction of climate and nature, like we said before. We can't blame the governments alone. We can't blame the businesses alone. It also comes to individual responsibility for some of the things that are happening. And then in the UNFCCC, I just wanted to a little bit highlight on what is happening there. We know that there has been discussion of the Gender Action Plan. Finally, it was approved all the way from work from the Lima Work Program. But how does it get implemented? Because we know that implementation happens at community level, in the national governments. All these policies are there, but if there's no strong national support to the global policies and actions, we won't see change happening. Now, they say you should walk the talk. So when you look at the statistics in the UNFCCC, you'll find that in terms of representation, the women are largely very poorly represented. We have delegations that are male-led. When you look at the leadership of those committees under the UNFCCC, the numbers of women are very low, and it's decreasing, continue to decrease. And then we also get issues of sexual harassment during the UNFCCC negotiations, which is making it very difficult for female civil servants who are in the negotiations teams to engage. And those really are structural and systemic issues around gender equality, where you find women are not in the high positions of the civil service. and that's why they can't be nominated to come to the delegations. And that means that even at country level, these issues are not being addressed at all. There's a lot of discussion going on around these issues, a lot of campaigns going on, but there's still a lot to be done to address some of those. And talking about the issue of finance, because even when we talk about justice and equality and whatever, we need the finances to support some of the processes, to support adaptation. I just wanted to highlight what the picture looks like globally in relation to the inequalities in the climate finance architecture. So one of the observations, we've been doing a lot of research here at IID under the work stream called Money Where It Matters, questioning where are the climate funds going. It may not be enough, but who is receiving it? Who is planning for it? Who is deciding how it should be used? I've shared some of those links and you can read more on that work. First of all, the global climate finance does not reach the levels where it should go. From the analysis is that 20% of all the funds is what goes for adaptation. And of all the funds, only 18% goes to the developing countries. And of the 18 of the funds, of the money that goes out, only 10% reach the local level. Why that is happening is because the funding mechanisms have made accreditation very complex for governments, especially developing country governments. Lots of lengthy processes, lots of requirements for documents that they can't even afford to put in place. So the accredited entities will be the UN agencies and other intermediaries who charge administrative costs and spend money on capacity building. The money ends up not going to the local level to really address the climate challenges that people are experiencing. And then we have interventions that are expensive, high transaction costs. So you have a project, you see the budget, but then the funds that go down into the project is really small. We've seen funding imbalances. The current mode of CSO funding, for example, civil societies are doing a lot of work on the ground. They have daily interaction with the communities and have programs in there. But even there, the inequality in the funding system is that the funds go to the bigger organizations. Those will be the international NGOs who are being funded by their own governments. So the small national organizations that are really on the forefront will not access the funds unless they partner with these big organizations. And the reason is like, oh, they are small, they can't manage the money. It's a risk, but yet they're the ones that are facing the actual risks and the ones that really have the needs for adaptation. So those imbalances have made the funding mechanisms really not, if we're talking about climate justice, the distributive channels and all that is not really working. So all those obstacles make it very difficult for the developing countries and the marginalized groups who face higher barriers to accessing such funds that that are being sent out. The OECD DAC did a study to look at the specific gender financing. And it was that 31% of the bilateral order is what goes for climate, and just 3% is what focuses on gender equality in relation to climate change. Others is like not very significant, the 28% just ticking the boxes. And we see also gender equality is more emphasized in adaptation, but not in mitigation. But we have examples of gendered and inclusive devolved climate funds. We support work here at IID, which we call Devolved Climate Funding Mechanism, with other partners like the World Bank, CIDA, and national governments. We've piloted this in Mali, Senegal, Kenya, Tanzania. But this fund is really trying to devolve the funds, because even in most of the countries, when they access the climate funds, it will stop at national level and not go down. But this mechanism tries to take money to the local level using local systems, and bringing in people at the forefront, starting with climate risk assessments, understanding what the people's issues are. They prioritize the project and work on proposals and make sure that all excluded groups are included in this, and focus on public goods investment, that everyday things that people need that are affected by climate, and then being able to allow flexible and adaptive management. But there are also other global funds like the GEF that has really been very good on focusing on small grants, acknowledging that there are small organizations who cannot access the money. They've given out like over 16,000 small grants, and they require that there should be a gender analysis, stakeholder consultations, gender responsive results framework. So these are some of those things that we need to learn from to see how equity in the distribution of climate funds can happen. On the climate governance at the national level, there's a problem there. It's a complex policy landscape. All this global, why I was looking at the global and the implications for national. So much discussion at global level, and then decisions are made. You have to make nationally determined contributions or NDCs. You have to develop NAPs. You have to do the national communication to the UNFCCC. You have to do green growth strategies. You have to do long-term strategies. Imagine all these demands are coming to one developing country government that does not have lots of capacity and funds to support these processes. And they have to report to internationally SDGs and all this. So that actually has largely been even a reason why there's no policy coherence at national level, because you have one ministry focusing on the NDC, another one is doing the NAP, another one is doing the SDG reporting, but there's no time to come together and sit and say what are our climate priorities as a country and how do we want to do this. And then, of course, multilaterals and donors offer and implement a one-size-fits-all solution. There's funding for this. Developing countries are getting the money. You must account by this time. You know, we are not learning from the adaptation practices that we are doing. We are not getting people involved because timelines, it's a 1-year project or 2 years project. Do it, finish, account. If you don't account, then we take back the money. That is the pressure that is happening at that level. And we are working with the least developed countries. There's a new initiative that has been started that is urging the donors to be flexible, to be patient, to focus on results than just accountability. And I think we need to think more of how we can support this kind of thinking, funding that is flexible, that is patient, that is considering people's capacities than just ticking boxes. We gave money, you didn't finish it, now account and bring it back. But then also at country level, there are projects of projectized and sectoral approaches. And that limit the impact really, because climate action requires cross-sector and multi-level approaches because it's cross-cutting through all sectors. We also have a problem where the whole of society approach is not considered. You have government working alone, civil society alone, private sector alone. Especially private sector has really been like, it's on the sideline in terms of climate discussions. And yet they also work with lots of community people supporting agriculture and whatever. So that coherence across whole of society, whole of government approach is not really working. And largely also the global climate policy framework really affects that. In terms of climate risk management, of course, this really goes with all those processes, short-term projects. There's no time to do proper climate risk management. And the risk management that is done, if we are talking about including women-led solutions, youth and vulnerable groups, there's need to do analysis of vulnerable sectors and the impacts they experience. We need to disaggregate the impacts for women, for the aged, for children, for migrants, for those living in risky locations. But the scenarios is that if a donor or an organization is supporting a climate risk assessment at country level, it will be in the sector that they are working in. If it's an education program, it will be do assessment for education, health. So countries don't even have enough information to know the level of their vulnerability or where they are in terms of adaptive capacity, which helps some of the responses. And then the coping mechanisms, are they increasing maladaptation? Are they sustainable? And then also asking the question if adaptation responses meet the local needs. I think this is what needs to happen to make sure everybody is on board. Now, amplifying women voices of the youth and women, the activism on climate change is on the increase. We are seeing the rise of powerful protests on everyday issues. Women and youth, civil society, grassroots, journalists are all in there. And it's a promising force for justice and equality, to be honest. We see climate now really on the highlights across different countries. There's stronger global campaign on climate action and the call for ambition on the climate targets. This is the 2021 is being called the super year, like really calling on governments to increase on ambition. We are seeing youth and women participation in new social movements, both online and offline, gaining lots of momentum, women leadership and influencing, and then the projects that they lead. But as much as all this is happening, it's not without challenges. We are seeing state impediments in some countries whereby they don't allow some of these activism. The SDG report 2019 was noting the gaps in promoting the rule of law and access to justice. We are seeing sustained assault and attack on civil society space, on human rights activists, whether on environment or climate. And still poor governance, of course, prevails, which is a cause of poverty and exclusion where people are not included. And we see governance mechanisms that don't include voices of women and youth. We see policies that are top down and not really capturing issues of different cross-society groups. And then the anti-civil society legislation in some of the countries really where some of these issues are being ignored, and the activists have to deal with these issues where they need support from other institutions to be able to continue with the good work that they are doing. So we ask ourselves, are they ready for this challenge of activism? The OECD produced a report in 2018, a youth stock taking report, and the findings were that the youth today are more educated and more informed than the previous generation, but they are facing unemployment, insecurity in their jobs. They have low confidence in their governments. That's what the youth responded. And they have the least influence on policies that affect them because really nobody engages them. And participation in formal institutional politics is decreasing. They are sort of becoming averse. Whether you participate or not, nothing is changing. And there's also low awareness on policies that affect them. We have all these youth on the streets saying climate change, things must change and all that. Activism is good, yes, going on the street, but then we have to be targeted. Which policy are you trying to influence? What is it saying and what do you want to change? We need to support these youth to arm them with information to be able to challenge these policies and offer solutions. We are seeing universities recently coming in and hosting such talks, which is really positive to get the young people to understand these issues, to understand the context, so that as they work, they know this is what we are targeting, because going on the streets alone will not give us the long-term solutions. So what needs to happen is that we need to build resilient organizations and strong leadership capabilities. And when I talk of leadership, I'm not talking about global leadership or in the institutions where we are, but local leadership that is able to mobilize and address issues that people are experiencing on a daily basis. Strengthening capabilities of grassroots organizations, because most of the time, if you look at the people who are doing activism, they are not the most educated, they are not the rich, they may not be you and me, they are the everyday people who have lost their livelihoods, whose land has been taken away, and those really need to be supported, strengthen their capabilities. That digital transformation is really important now, even in governments where there's totalitarian mechanisms where they don't want people to communicate. We've seen the role of digital transformation, helping share information, though there's clamped down on it as well, where everything is switched off. But how do we use this to support the youth to access information and also use that information to enhance accountability, to report on climate risks and all? And then we need to see funders really increasing support for youth and women organizations and grassroots organizations, funds that are patient and predictable, and also effective and accountable institutions. So I stole this from somewhere, which really is very nice to look at the equity issues. And yeah, we talk about equality or equity or whatever, but still, as much as we put in efforts, some challenges still exist. In the first one, you see there's a ladder there, the shorter person is up, but they still can't see there. So we still need to work on some of these things to make sure that equality and access to resources and responses target everybody despite of their weight or height or capacity to cope with different things. And as I finish, just some messages. As much as we talk about women-led solutions, I've worked on gender equality for many years, and I've been challenged in some of the presentations I make most of the time, because my understanding of gender is about men and women, boys and girls. Most of the time we interpret it to mean women, and I wanted to highlight it here, that we need to work with male decision makers to champion female leadership. Because talking to the women alone and finding women-only solutions has failed to work. The slide that showed the representation at the UNFCCC, it shows very limited representation of women. So can those women influence anything to change? Or we need to target the men that are heading the corporations, the organizations, to tell them that it's important to work with women, it's important to be inclusive so that change can happen. So we need the male champions to advance the women-led solutions. Inclusive governance of climate decisions that is centered on gender equality and social justice is really key. And it's something that has to be done intentionally. Most of the times organizations have these tick boxes, gender, yes, men and women are present, but it's not really about that. It's about looking at structures and systems that perpetuate inequality and being able to challenge those either through what we do, through research and evidence, through knowledge and sharing. And it's something that has to be done intentionally. Monitoring climate commitments made by the international and national institutions is important. The issue of accountability that is community driven, where we have citizen engagement, citizens engaging with their governments to understand what they are offering, is really important. It cannot be done by experts. We need people taking things into their stride and asking their governments to be accountable, and governments engaging with the citizens that they're responsible for. Advocacy and pressure on developed countries to assume their responsibility must continue, because there's the challenge now of how do you balance economic growth with emission reduction. That's why we're seeing countries really not committed towards doing things that will promote low carbon development. So the pressure I think that is mounting now is good. We hear countries declaring climate emergency, increasing funding. That pressure has to continue. The other one is decolonization of knowledge. We have a challenge where we feel like if you have a PhD or you've studied in a university, then you know everything, which is not true. We have these grassroots movements and organizations and communities that have very useful knowledge towards adaptation, indigenous local knowledge in weather predicting and stuff. We need to co-design and co-implement solutions with local people because they understand the context. No one is more important than the other. No knowledge is useless. So we really need to do that. And then also including women and gendered local experiences to disrupt some of the dominant discourse and of things that this is not important, because most of the times we're like, oh, women, women, but we have evidence to show people that when you include women, this happens, you know. Most of the time we're just saying include women. Why? We fail to really nail that debate. And that's why, and when we sort of target too much women, I mean, I've worked with governments, I've worked with whatever. They call the gender people when they see that, oh, the gender person has come. So gender is just like a tag that is used without looking at the importance of why are we doing it? Why are we talking about it? I think we need to do more of these so that our debates are really grounded in practical realities of what could happen if you are more inclusive, if you worked more with women, if you understood their issues. And the last one is that response to climate change should also not create inequitable adaptation policies and responses that exclude the most vulnerable. And also the cost of adaptation should not be inequitably distributed, because most of the policies are done at the top level. The local people don't even know about policies, meaning they don't include their views. So most of them are not fit for purpose. It's just ticking a box. We have a policy as a country, but who is it helping and who is engaging with it? Yeah, I think that would be some of the things, of the messages that I would like to share. So there are some of the materials I put up here for reading in your own time. Yeah, thank you so much for listening to me.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. This has been extremely enlightening. And I hope that maybe I can get the slides from you afterwards and I'll post it to our cohort shared resources folder. And I will facilitate some Q&A from our fellows now. So if you have questions, please put your name or put your question in the chat and I'll call on you. And I would just like to start, Tracy, with just a question about your background and how you got involved in this work focused on gender and climate. Like what parts of your educational experience or work experience kind of brought you to where you are now? That would be great to hear.
Yeah, okay. For the gender journey, really, I started working with the local civil society organization, a water and sanitation project, working with SNV, the Netherlands Development Organization. And gender, I had no training in gender apart from the school training, not the practical one. But I think that was my first learning experience on really dealing with communities on gender issues. What does water mean for men and women? In terms of the roles related to water, but also the economic impacts. If they don't have clean water and the family is sick, then who pays the money at the end of the day? And looking at impacts for households and individuals and all that. And of course in government, and I learned different experiences, because in government, gender equality is a cross-cutting issue, but to be honest, it's a ticking the box. Women have come, tick, there's an assistant who is a woman, tick, you know. There's no much learning from that. That's why I'm saying we need to go deeper. But my gender work was really strengthened in Care International. That is really, really, really deeply focused on gender equality through training, through practical approaches to gender and climate. And for the climate work, because in Care, I was working as a gender and conflict advisor on a natural resource management program. And climate was becoming a very important issue. That was 2007. And they wanted somebody to do it, and nobody was willing because the knowledge on climate was limited. People didn't know what to do. I offered myself. I usually tell people volunteering is one of the nice things you can ever do. There's a lot of learning that happens with it. But because I had to do it, then I told my boss I need to be trained because I can't do something that I'm very raw about. So I went to the Swedish Meteorology and Hydrology Institute in 2011 and did a one-year course there, classroom research, and then another phase again, which was very, very helpful. So training is one of those things, not the classroom training, but the practical training. because one thing I liked about that course, we had time for the class, and then we had to do a research where you go to the communities, use the tools practically, do the analysis, and come back and share experience and learn from others. That was really, really helpful. And from that, then I refocused my career because I was doing climate gender, which was climate gender and conflict. So I decided to focus on gender and climate and dropped the conflict part of it, as much as it was nice to do. Reframed my career and then joined the Africa Climate Change Resilience Alliance. I had been working with government before, but now we're working on government policy processes, capacity building, influencing, and working with civil society. We're working in Uganda, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, which was really, really good experience for me at that point. We were working on weather information systems with meteorology organizations. It was good exposure, sharing some of those lessons in international conferences and others. And then I joined the Irish Aid Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where I was really focusing on climate largely. So it's been a very exciting journey, lots of learning, but I want to, the experience is really, really useful. The classroom learning is important, but it's not enough. When you go to the field, you find that what you've learned and the realities on the ground is very different. You go to the community telling them about climate, they understand, yes, things have changed, but when they tell you the impacts, they are not talking about sectors. They are talking about, we don't have food, we can't take our children to school because we don't have the money, a drought came, we lost our food. The diseases increased because it was flooding all year through. So you'll find all these impacts across sectors. It doesn't matter which sector you work with. So that field experience gives you the grasp of things, of the impacts and how they manifest for different people, and the impacts on the different groups as well. I facilitated meetings where if you talk to the women alone and talk to the men alone about the impacts, their experiences are also completely different. You'll think maybe they live in a different village, but they are the same. So shaped by our roles, by their responsibilities, by their perception of risk. So yeah, I think that has been the journey, and it's been really exciting for me. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. That's really fascinating. And yeah, it resonates a lot with what you can learn in school versus through talking to people and through applied research and being in the community and empowering local stakeholders to take action and have a voice. We have a bunch of questions coming in from our fellows, and I'll just read the first one, and I can call on others if you want to share them yourselves. But this question from Ashish is, which part of the world from your experience is most responsive to climate change?
Wow, that's a hard one. So to be honest, yeah, there are countries that are really responsive. From my experience, what I've seen, I'll quote two countries, I think. One of them is don't quote me, it may be that the emissions are high or whatever, but the responsiveness. I'll talk about the Swedish government because during my course, we interacted a lot with the government and we learned the process of how did they start understanding climate issues and addressing them. First of all, the process was fascinating for me. Early in the process, they started with doing a whole country assessment of what do people know about climate change and the impacts to them as individuals and to their country. When they did that assessment, they found that almost 67% did not know what climate impacts could mean for them and their country. So the awareness was really low. They finished that, they did that for a whole year, and they started another process where they started awareness campaigns on what does climate mean for you? What does it mean for the country? They did that one. And then after, they designed a strategy on addressing climate change. I've not had any country do that. Because that's a strategy that is really informed by what people are saying, what they know, what they don't know. And in that strategy, that's where they impose taxes. If you're using a car that is not using biodegradable fuel, you pay this amount. And people pay because they've been educated about what it means for them. So they said they were facing limited resistance because everybody had been part of the process. And we visited some of the smaller cities where you find municipal councils are using the waste generated in their cities to get to power their cities, to heat the water in their cities, you know. We visited one of the factories where they separate the gases. There's really focus on what climate is. How do we reduce emissions? How do we turn some of the waste that could even increase emissions into something positive that we can use? So that's one of the countries that I could quote, especially the issue of transport, providing free bicycles. You don't have to come with your car, come with a tram. There's a bicycle, go shopping, bring it back, go to the tram. So some of the practices we learned were really, you see a country that is really committed. But I also want to quote another country from Africa. I would talk about Ethiopia, despite the challenges that are happening and everything. But that's one country that showed an example of policy coherence, because what they did, they developed what they call a climate resilient green economy strategy that focuses on mitigation and adaptation. It was a deep consultation process because we know that in Africa, the issue is really about adaptation, not mitigation. So they put everything together. So whatever policy demand that comes from the global level, they refer you to this strategy. It is their master plan. Whatever you want has to come from the strategy. And that I've not seen that anywhere else. And it has got a lot of traction, a lot of donor support, because it's an organized process of how they manage in the country. And not to say that they're doing the best, better than other countries, but at least in terms of policy coherence, they are doing very well. I would add Rwanda, who have a local revenue climate fund where they collect money internally in country to support that fund mechanism, the climate change fund, which has failed in most of the countries that are waiting for donors to bring in the money. It's an example of a country that is really putting in effort to contribute to support climate responses before waiting for donors to bring the money. I think those three have been most fascinating for me. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. That's really, really interesting and good to note about the policy coherence level. Yeah. So let's see, Olivia or Sophia, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Tracy. Thank you so much for coming. This was very cool. So I have actually two questions. I noticed that you talked a lot about how policies at the local level could be very important because, you know, small communities know better what they need. And at least in my experience, from what I see, many democracies don't give that much power to the local level. Do you think that needs to be changed in order to fight climate change better and achieve climate justice?
Yeah, exactly. That speaks to the slide where I was talking about devolved climate finance. And it's not just about finance, it's also about climate leadership, where I said we need leadership at the local level. The example of the work that we've done here at IID on making sure money reaches where it matters and piloting how you devolve the functions of decision-making and distribution of funds and utilization of funds to the local people has really worked, because then you're addressing real climate problems. We have a problem whereby funds come to the national level, there's no consultation that has been done, and then a decision is made, we are going to construct a dam or to do something. And if you ask the people, that's not what they want. So what we are trying to do is like go to the county level, move from the national to the county, where people really are, do a climate risk assessment. I keep asking people, what makes your project a climate project? You've not done a climate risk assessment. Maybe even where you're implementing, they don't have any climate issues at all, you know? But just because you'd either politician will say, I want it in my area, because they have climate funds, there's nothing that is informing the context of that project. So climate risk assessment is important. What are the climate risks in that area? How are they impacting the local people? And what kind of projects can we put in place to strengthen adaptation, to respond, you know? And then in these projects, communities develop their own proposals of what they want. We facilitate community-led theories of change. If we do this and we manage, you know, to make sure that sustainability is built into this, then the projects really focus on those issues. And then the management of projects is also done by communities, where committees are put in place. And we look at issues of inclusive leadership, where you have women and youth also leading on those committees to decide what adaptation should look like for them. So in the 5 countries where we've piloted that, it has really, really worked. And it strengthens women leadership where they were not able to engage in meetings or to speak or to have leadership roles to decide on what should happen. We see that happening a lot. So it's still a process because, as you say, most of the countries want to keep things at high level. So that is the pressure that we're putting on. We've recently developed the principles of locally led adaptation, and we're getting donors to sign up to that. Everything must be focused on from the local perspective. Because we're here, I'm here in the UK, I don't know what is happening on the ground. You know, it is the people that are really at the front line who are experiencing most of these challenges. So we can't sit and plan for them. They need to be part of it. Yeah.
And I have another question about youth. At least here in my country, my generation from like 18 to 25, 80% of young people don't vote. And I found that just mind-blowing. And I was wondering, I don't know, because I don't know why that happens. I have a few theories that I read about. But I would love to hear insights. For example, I read about it could be the way politicians communicate. It's not in a language that young people understand. I read about could be the way politics are presented in school. And I would love to hear insights. What do you think it's happening in a more?
Which country do you come from?
Portugal.
Portugal, okay. So the issue of the youth, they had talked about it a bit. One of the things is that the political landscape right now does not really talk about the youth. When we look at the policies, I've worked with government. If you look at the people that represent constituencies, the youth are very few. Like in my country, in Uganda, there will be a youth position, but that will be just one youth out of the so many adults. And we have governments, especially in developing countries, governments that have been in power for years and years and years. And we have youth that are finishing school, they don't have jobs, and the politics have become monetized. If you don't have money to buy votes and give to the people, in most countries, you'll not get the votes. And the youth don't have the money to invest in these processes. And yet they have very good ideas that they could put forward, but they are not getting the space to engage at all. So I think it, of course, it varies from country to another, but in the developing countries, that's a big problem. The democracy is not really working. The youth are excluded. The funds that are related to politics, the youth don't have those kinds of funds. They have new innovative ideas that nobody's thinking about. They are not part of the policy making process. So some of them have really become complacent and just given up, because they're trying and things are not working, so why waste my time voting anyway? But we're also seeing again a lot of youth coming up politically to challenge the status quo. We've seen riots in Nigeria, in Uganda, in other countries where the youth are really coming up. And they want to tell you in the coming years, youth will be a force to reckon with, because in Africa alone, 63% of the population is young. And that speaks volumes. What is going to happen in the next 10 years? We are going to have a population of 80% youth, and definitely they'll have to take leadership. So this is the time to really support youth leadership, whether for climate or for whatever, because the future is with the youth, to be honest. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for that response. And maybe we can end on your question, Mickey. If is your internet working? Are you able to share? And then we can close things out. Yeah, awesome.
For sure. Thank you so much for such a really fascinating talk. I had some internet issues, so missed like about 5-minute chunks. So I hope.
Nope, Mickey, you just muted yourself.
Yeah.
Come back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question mainly revolves around the idea that co-producing knowledge and inclusion of marginalized communities at kind of high level things like the UNFCCC processes and COPs, but also on the ground level is often really kind of difficult and muddy and kind of not very clear in which ways organizations are doing these things. And often inclusion can be quite tokenistic for
You muted yourself again.
So weird. I don't know why that's happened. I'm not even touching it.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. Yeah, keep going.
I'm wondering if there's been any kind of talk or push for a streamlined or kind of strategized way of how organizations and countries have to approach this idea that you were talking about in terms of including communities and including voices and in what that might look like, because there's all of these wonderful things that you said at the end in your summary, and I imagine all of those would go in there. But is there anything that can keep people accountable to their attempts at inclusion?
Yeah, I think that's a long life challenge that we'll continue working on. But I want to talk about the efforts that are going on. My work here at IID, the team I lead works on linking those local to global knowledge platforms. And I want to talk about responsibility. As much as we want inclusion, we also need to know the mandates. Who does what? How do we include people? And what would be their role? I think that's very key. When we talk about the UNFCCC, I've had noise, oh, we are not in the UNFCCC, but the UNFCCC is a government body where you must be a member of a government to enter the room and enter into the negotiations. So if we want to include people, then what should we look at? Before the negotiations happen, there are processes that happen pre-COP events. There's the national consultations on the COP happen. We have the Bonn conferences that happen. We have all these regional climate summits that happen. So which opportunity do you use to get your messages to the negotiators so that by the time they go for the COP, you've already spoken to them. You've already told them what your agenda is. The challenge is that most people don't have information on these processes. So they are waiting for the COP to happen to go wherever it is and make noise, oh, climate change, you know, that doesn't work, to be honest. So before, actually, as the year starts, we need to be thinking, how do we influence the decision makers? How do we get our views in there? So at IID, we host events in between the year that really focus on bringing local voices into discussions about adaptation. We have what we call the Community-Based Adaptation Conference. I can share links as well. It's really big, brings in over 300 organizations globally. And we are talking about adaptation and then come up with messages that will be shared later because everybody comes and gives their contribution. And then in our daily work as well, we are partnering with universities. There's the consortium of least developed countries, universities consortium on climate change. And we've been bringing in grassroots organizations, talking to the universities. How can universities support the co-production of knowledge that is based on local experiences? The challenge we have is that when you're doing research in a university, the main target is you want to be published in a journal somewhere, and that's not helping the world, to be honest. Yes, the knowledge is important, but can we also, in addition to the journal articles, go to the communities, do our research with them? They are not technical, but they have all the information we need. They may want to advocate to government over service. They don't know how to package that information. As an experienced person, university person or whatever, work with them, package it into a policy brief or an advocacy paper or whatever that they can take to the government, because most governments are not listening to small organizations because they think their information is not credible. But if you have that this paper is produced by this indigenous group with a university of this place, then definitely somebody will listen to that information. So we are really calling on universities to work more with communities so that their research is informed by real issues, by real challenges, by lived experiences of these people at the front line of climate change. So those conversations are happening. We've just completed a study with the World Bank, funded by the World Bank, where we are looking at citizen engagement in climate policy and decision making. And we are talking to communities that every day are struggling with governments to get entry points, and they are not. So we are looking at what mechanisms we can use, how can government support them. So I think you need to be intentional and strategic in how you do the inclusion and engagement. It's not just chasing the big events, it's work that you have to do right from the start. That's all I can say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. This has been really helpful to us to process what we're going through in our climate change learning journey in the course, and to help us think about the future and the coming year. So I really appreciate your time, and I hope we can find more ways to stay engaged with you as an online climate school.
Sure.
And yeah, so I think that'll wrap us up for today. And I'll share the recording with the fellows and with you, Tracy, as soon as it's converted to YouTube. And thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. It was
Thanks,
great speaking
everyone.
to all of you, and happy holidays, everyone.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Happy holidays. Bye.
Happy
Bye.
holidays.
Bye.